In the heart of Southeast Asia, cloaked in mystery and intrigue, lies an expansive cityscape devoid of life. Welcome to Myanmar's $4 billion mega-ghost city. Imagine a city vast and sprawling, stretching out as far as the eye can see. Skyscrapers that scrape the heavens, wide boulevards meant to accommodate throngs of pedestrians, grand parks designed for leisurely strolls, and residential complexes waiting to echo with the laughter of children. Yet this city, situated in the heart of Myanmar, bears an eerie silence. It's as if time itself has stopped, frozen in the moment of its creation. This is no ordinary city. It's a city born out of aspirations, ambitions, and an investment of a whopping $4 billion. It was envisioned as a testament to progress, a symbol of a nation stepping into the future. But today, it stands as a monolith of mystery and paradox. Located near the country's capital, Naypyidaw, this cityscape is an enigma wrapped in a riddle. It's a city that was built to house millions, yet it remains largely uninhabited. Its wide roads, meant for bustling traffic, see only the occasional vehicle. Its buildings, designed to accommodate a growing population, are nothing more than hollow shells. The parks, devoid of laughter and life, echo with an unshakable silence. The city, in its stillness, whispers tales of dreams unfulfilled, of promises unkept. It's a city that should have been teeming with life, yet it stands forlorn, waiting for its inhabitants who never came. But why is this city, built with such grand ambitions, deserted? What led to the creation of this colossal ghost city, and more importantly, why does it continue to stand empty? What secrets does it hold within its silent streets and vacant buildings? But how did this sprawling metropolis come to be, and why does it stand empty to this day? Journey with us as we unravel the enigmatic tale of Myanmar's ghost city. Our story begins in 2008 in the wake of a devastating cyclone that ravaged the country of Myanmar. This was a year that would forever change the landscape of this Southeast Asian nation. Cyclone Nargis, one of the deadliest storms the world had ever seen, had left a path of destruction in its wake. Over 140,000 lives were lost and millions were left homeless. The country was in dire straits, grappling with a disaster of an unprecedented scale. In the midst of this chaos, the government made a startling announcement. The capital of the country would be relocated. The decision was met with surprise and confusion. After all, why would a nation reeling from a disaster invest in moving its capital city? But the wheels were set in motion. The chosen site for the new capital was a remote location in the center of the country. A location that was, until then, nothing more than a vast, unpopulated expanse. Yet it was here that the government envisioned a city that would rise like a phoenix from the ashes of disaster. The construction began in earnest. Thousands of workers were brought in, working around the clock to transform the barren landscape into a bustling metropolis. Roads were carved, buildings erected, infrastructure laid down, all in a bid to create a city that would not only serve as the new administrative heart of the country, but also stand as a symbol of resilience and renewal. Yet even as the city started to take shape, it was shrouded in an air of mystery. There were whispers of a city being built in isolation, far from the prying eyes of the world. A city that was being constructed not for the people, but for the powers that be. And so the foundation for what would become the ghost city was laid, a city conceived in the aftermath of disaster. Rising from the ashes of a national tragedy, the city was envisioned as a sparkling metropolis, a symbol of Myanmar's resilience and ambition. Like a phoenix born anew, the mega-ghost city was supposed to be an emblem of a promising future, a beacon of hope for a nation in recovery. The construction process was a mammoth task, a Herculean effort that consumed vast resources. It was a project of unprecedented scale and scope, a venture that demanded an investment of $4 billion. This was no ordinary city. It was to be a mega-city, a sprawling metropolis teeming with life, buzzing with energy and brimming with potential. The plans for the city were as grand as they were ambitious. It was to be a hub of commerce and culture, a center for innovation and industry. It was to be a city that would rival the great cities of the world, a city that would put Myanmar on the global map. The city was meticulously designed, with every detail carefully considered. Its streets were planned to accommodate a bustling population. Its buildings were designed to house thriving businesses. Its public spaces were envisioned as vibrant community hubs. The city was to be a living, breathing entity, a dynamic ecosystem of people and places. But as the city rose, so too did the contrast between its grand vision and its grim reality. The city that was supposed to be a bustling metropolis was instead a ghost town. The buildings that were supposed to house thriving businesses stood empty. The streets that were supposed to be filled with people were deserted. The public spaces that were supposed to be vibrant community hubs were lifeless. Yet despite the grandeur of its design, the city remains eerily silent, a testament to dreams unfulfilled. The mega-ghost city stands today as a stark reminder of what could have been, a monument to ambition and resilience, but also a symbol of dreams that remain unfulfilled. Fast forward to today, the ghost city stands as a surreal monument to ambition and folly. Imagine an urban landscape, meticulously planned and built, yet virtually devoid of life. This is the reality of Myanmar's ghost city. Sprawling over a vast area, the city is a testament to the audacity of human ambition, yet it stands largely empty. Its towering buildings and expansive roads, once symbols of a grand vision, now serve as haunting reminders of a dream unfulfilled. Why, you might wonder, does such a colossal city remain uninhabited? The answer lies in a blend of socio-economic, political, and logistical factors. The city's remote location, far from established economic hubs, has proven to be a major deterrent. Additionally, the high cost of living, coupled with limited job opportunities, has made the city an unattractive option for many. However, the ghost city isn't just a story of unfulfilled dreams and financial missteps. It's also a hotbed for speculation and theories. Some say the city was built as a vanity project, a grand gesture with little thought for practicality. Others speculate it was intended as a haven for the elite, a utopia isolated from the rest of the country. While these theories abound, the truth remains as elusive as the city's phantom population. Despite its deserted state, the ghost city isn't entirely devoid of activity. Occasionally, you'll find government employees going about their day, their presence a stark contrast to the city's overwhelming emptiness. But largely, the city is a ghost town, in the truest sense of the term, its silence only broken by the occasional rustle of wind or the distant cry of a solitary bird. The city's eerie silence is a stark reminder of the grand plans that went awry. Yet it also stands as a symbol of potential, a canvas waiting to be brought to life. The city's fate hangs in the balance, its future as uncertain as the motivations behind its creation. As the sun sets over the deserted streets, the ghost city continues to hold its secrets, a silent sentinel in the heart of Myanmar. As we stand at the precipice of a new era, the future of the ghost city hangs in the balance. What was once a symbol of ambition and progress now stands as a testament to the challenges of unchecked development. This $4 billion phantom metropolis, a city that was supposed to be bustling with life, is now a haunting reminder of forgotten dreams. But let's shift our gaze to the horizon, to the potential future of this city. Could it be that the ghost city might yet awaken from its slumber? Could these deserted streets echo with the laughter of children, the bustle of commerce, the hum of everyday life? It's a possibility, a faint glimmer on the horizon, yet it is not without its challenges. The task of breathing life into this ghostly metropolis is Herculean. It requires not just massive investment, but also a vision that is in tune with the needs of the people and the environment. It's a delicate balancing act, one that could have far-reaching implications not just for Myanmar, but for the wider world. It's a powerful reminder of the need for sustainable, inclusive development. Yet, despite the hurdles, there's a sense of resilience that permeates the air. A belief that this city, this testament to human ambition, can be more than just a haunting echo of what could have been. In the end, only time will tell the true tale of Myanmar's ghost city, a tale of ambition, resilience, and the haunting beauty of forgotten dreams. And so, we end our journey through the enigmatic streets of Myanmar's ghost city. Born from a vision of grandeur and now standing as a testament to the unpredictability of time, this $4 billion city of specters presents a captivating mystery. A city birthed, risen, and now standing alone, its future uncertain. The intrigue it weaves is as dense as the silence that fills its broad avenues. If you've enjoyed this journey into the heart of Myanmar's ghost city, be sure to share this video with your friends, give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and theories about this fascinating place. Until next time, keep exploring the mysteries of our world.